In 1971, a psychological thriller directed by first-time director at the time, Clint Eastwood, hit the big screen. That movie was Play Misty For Me. The movie also starred Clint Eastwood, along with Jessica Walter and Donna Mills. This movie is a psychological thriller that clearly pays homage to movies that came before it like Psycho. Although it really doesn't quite live up to those classic thrillers, it's a quality movie. And this was a stepping stone of Clint Eastwood becoming the great director that he is today. He plays a disc jockey named Dave Garver on KRML radio, where he broadcasts nightly from a studio in Carmel-by-the-Sea, California. Dave is just a too cool for school radio disc jockey. He claims to be hung up on one woman, but that doesn't stop him from sleeping with Evelyn Draper, played by Jessica Walter, who he easily picks up from a bar. But you soon find out that the reason she was such an easy pickup from that bar was that she's a big fan of his radio show, and that she knows that he hangs out in this bar after work. She often calls in to request that he play the jazz standard Misty. Dave should at that point start to have red flags go off everywhere in his head about Evelyn. But you soon find out that red flags don't mean anything to Dave. Evelyn then shows up unannounced at his house the following night, ready to cook him dinner. Despite his initial apprehension, he ends up sleeping with her. When she shows up the following night, you guessed it right, he sleeps with her yet again, and this is despite running into Toby Williams, who's played by Donna Mills, and this is the woman that he wants to seriously pursue. Evelyn definitely has her issues. She's a psychological nightmare. She attacks Dave's housekeeper and his current girlfriend later in the film, even killing a police officer. Evelyn convinces herself that she loves Dave and that he loves her back. Jessica Walter is an absolute icon in this role. She was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Actress in this role. This film is clearly a love letter also to Monterey County in California, which is Clint Eastwood's adoptive home. He actually served as the mayor of Carmel for 2 years because he just got sick of the way the politicians were running the city. Somebody mentioned to him, "Why don't you run?" And before you knew it, he did. And he won. The movie includes a scene from the Monterey Jazz Festival, which has been a tradition in this county since 1958. The first scene that Clint Eastwood shot in this film was with his former director in a cameo role, and that former director was Don Siegel, and he plays Murph, the bartender. As a joke, Clint Eastwood made Siegel do 11 takes on this shoot. Then he turned and told the cameraman to put the film in the camera. He and Don Siegel were great friends, so I'm sure this got a bunch of laughs from everybody. Universal Pictures originally wanted Lee Remick to be cast in the role of Evelyn, but Clint Eastwood had been super impressed with Jessica Walter's performance in Sidney Lumet's movie The Group from 1966, and this led him to want to cast her instead. The initial storyline of the movie was set in Los Angeles, but at Clint Eastwood's insistence, this movie was shot in the more comfortable surroundings of Carmel-by-the-Sea, where he could shoot scenes at the local radio station, the bars, the restaurants, and houses of his personal acquaintances. Universal Pictures gave Clint Eastwood just carte blanche on this film. They told him he had his individual freedom to do what he wanted. But this is so Clint Eastwood. He finished the shooting of this movie 4 days ahead of schedule and $50,000 under budget. This is a thing that you see on all of his directorial stuff. This guy is a master at pleasing the studios and the pocketbooks of the investors. Now, there's one little tidbit that we covered when we did the film Dirty Harry, and that's that when Clint Eastwood walks in to the restaurant prior to the bank robbery, in the background you can see a theater marquee, and on that theater marquee you will see the title, Play Misty For Me, as the current movie being played at this theater. When Clint Eastwood told Universal executive Lew Wasserman that he wanted to direct this movie, Wasserman immediately agreed. Then, as Eastwood and his agent were walking down the hall, Wasserman called the agent back into his office. In exchange for letting Eastwood direct the film, they wanted to pay him less than his regular salary under his 3-movie deal that he had with the studio. Clint Eastwood said he understood completely, given that he was a first-time director. In the end, he made the movie for a percentage of the gross. The radio station, KRML, that his character works for, is actually a jazz station in Carmel by the Sea, and the studio is located at San Carlos and 5th Street, in the same building as the Hog's Breath Inn, a restaurant that Clint Eastwood owned. After a brief dark period in 2010, the radio station returned to the air in 2011. Now, this movie is one of the few movies that Clint Eastwood directed that wasn't produced through Warner Brothers. Actually, his first 4 films as a director were made through Universal Pictures, and this is where his Malpaso production company was based. Clint Eastwood then moved to Warner Brothers, where he remains to the present day, although there are a few films that have been made with other studios outside of this long-standing Warner deal that he has. Jessica Walter has contributed to multiple puff pieces about Clint Eastwood, in which she really praises him enthusiastically. However, the late Sandra Locke, who had a long relationship with Clint Eastwood, noted in her autobiography that when she talked to Jessica Walter at a party in 1971, right after the film had been made, she said that she spoke in very measured tones about Clint, and that she got the distinct impression that she didn't view him as a very generous actor, or a good human being for that matter. This seems to me like a scorned woman talking. Now, the movie from 1987, Fatal Attraction, draws heavily on this movie in developing its plot, with its storyline of an affair that goes terribly wrong. Now, where did the idea of this stalker come from? Well, there's a couple of schools of thought on this. Clint Eastwood had really experienced something very similar to this about 21 years prior to the movie. This happened around 1950 when an ex-girlfriend stalked him tenaciously, and she would continually threaten to commit suicide when he broke up with her. So I'm sure some of the experiences that he had in this film were a direct correlation to his personal experiences that he had with his ex-girlfriend. But the real coincidence in the storyline is from the radio storyteller Gene Shepard, and he claimed that this movie was based on a real-life incident where he was stalked by a female fan. Shepard goes on to tell a story about himself in which a woman was obsessed with his radio persona, and she was so obsessed that she ended up killing 6 people. Later in the program, he continues the story and he locates it to Cincinnati. He goes on to say that there are some extreme parallels in his own personal life and this film, and they seem like actual repetitions of actual events that happened to him in the radio business. He states that this radio business and working in the media has created a new kind of psychosis. Now you have to admit, it does seem kind of far-fetched to say that this girl goes on to kill 6 people. But his shows were really hard to separate fact from fiction. Whether he was just telling a story that was a made-up story, or whether this was a story that actually happened in real life. So I guess Gene Shepard is the only one that really knows whether there was a true basis for the movie Play Misty For Me. This movie was a financial success for the studio and for Clint Eastwood. The movie grossed almost $11 million in U.S. and Canadian box office, and this was against a budget of less than $1 million. The film was given mostly positive reviews by the critics, and it was called a coolly calculated psychological thriller that manages to really scare the audience, even if it's just using the textbook thrills that are common to these shows. I remember seeing this movie when it came out in theaters, and it was a great one in my mind. It's also very fun to go back and watch again. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll continue to chase the classics.